200 years later. 1. Charlotte. Lady Charlotte Sand had been born to calm the restless dead. Morning dew slicked her favorite boots as she walked through the wraithwood. The runes embroidered along the edges of her deep blue settling robes shimmered silver in the sunlight. White pointed flowers covered orange trees like tiny bundled stars. Their smell curled around Charlotte, so thick and sweet that she would swear the air was nectar. Here, in the quiet of her family's citrus groves, the bones of local wraiths found solace. This place should calm her spirit, too, as it had every one of her 18 summers. Instead, Charlotte moved through her duties at double her normal pace, as if the next moment held something infinitely better than the last. Her ceremonial garment was heavy in the humid air, and she wished in vain for breeches and a simple shirt. Charlotte sighed, then began humming the settling tune as she searched for wraiths that may have been agitated in their rest. Even once they'd been settled, exposure to the anger or pain of others could rouse them again. But the wood was quiet, as usual, Charlotte's skill unneeded. A horse whinnied, and Charlotte turned to see her grandmother in the road at the edge of the wraithwood. Lavender smoke from the old woman's smudging stick drifted across the spring grass and through the orange blossoms, filling Charlotte with a sense of home and longing. "Every creature from here to town can feel the discontent rolling off you," called Grandmother. "You'll wake the wraiths on your own if you aren't careful." "It's not discontent," grumbled Charlotte. But Charlotte didn't know what to call it either. This feeling akin to emptiness. Maybe it was emptiness, just not the desolate kind. It was a vessel waiting to be filled, a place in her chest wide open and ready for possibilities. From the ground, a shard of white caught the sun, and Charlotte knelt to touch the bleached bone. The wraith inhabiting it gave a small shiver. Charlotte forced a smile, encouraging the wraith to rest. Its weak consciousness grasped greedily at the edges of the piece she offered, before quieting as Charlotte pressed the bone deeper into the loam. This wraith would remain settled for a long while, as long as no one disturbed it. When she stood, her grandmother called again. "Come, Charlotte." The weight in the woman's voice spoke to every one of her 74 years. "A wraith's risen in Sparrow's Glen. If we leave now, we might settle it before dark." Sure enough, Charlotte's old horse Iris was saddled and ready beside her grandmother's. She mounted, and Grandmother passed Charlotte's rapier to her. Charlotte belted it over her robes and nodded her thanks. She always preferred to meet the dark with her blade, even if it wouldn't do an ounce of good. Blades did nothing to either fight or settle wraiths, unless they were wielded by a guardian of the order. But Charlotte's sword gave her courage and reminded her of her father. It was like carrying his memory on her hip. The two of them rode toward the small hamlet of Sparrow's Glen. Charlotte's family owned most of the land for a day's ride in any direction from Sand Manor. The town closest to their home, just beyond the orchards, was Braden, and Charlotte had spent her childhood running through its streets with the local children. Sparrow's Glen was one of many villages not large enough to have their own people to settle the dead. When they encountered wraiths, they called on Grandmother, and more recently, on Charlotte. "I know this isn't what you want, Charlotte," said Grandmother. "But only you could have felt that wraith's need so quickly." The pity in the old woman's eyes made Charlotte's chest burn. "You don't have to remind me," said Charlotte. "I'm doing my duty. I'll keep doing my duty." Her grandmother was right, though. Charlotte was not good at settling wraiths. She was brilliant. Even on her worst day, she'd never met a spirit she could not help. That wasn't to say it was always easy, but she hadn't had to ask Grandmother for assistance since she was 14. The empty feeling within Charlotte yawned wide, her heartbeat picking up, with the terror of a future unvaried. Grandmother nudged her horse close enough to rest a thin hand on Charlotte's arm. "You have always done what is asked of you, child," she said, not unkindly. "But the dead can feel when you work from duty rather than mercy. Don't give what you must. Give what they need." Charlotte resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She knew her role. What they did was more than important, it was imperative. Others could learn to settle the dead, but not many chose to. It was damned uncomfortable to be around them sometimes, but Charlotte's family had a history. Even so, being pushed into a shape that felt like someone else's never sat well with her, no matter how many spirits she helped. Things would be so different if... Charlotte caught the last words before they could escape, but her grandmother heard them all the same. "When Worth wakes, it will be for your brother," she said. Charlotte wished desperately for another glimmer of an agitated wraith among the shadowed orchard, anything to give her an excuse not to have this conversation. Since their father's death 10 years ago, Charlotte's elder brother had run their home, the estate, and her life with a consistency that drove her mad. At only 26, Lord William Sand was thoroughly entrenched in life as a country farmer, which was fine. The estate wasn't the part of her brother's inheritance she resented. No, that honor belonged to the sleeping scarecrow warrior currently hanging in the yard. Parson Rainier Worthington, the wraith of light who had partnered with her father and generations of Sands before him. More than 200 years ago, the parson had helped create the Order of Guardians, a small group of elite soldiers who used their powers against wielded wraiths to protect the throne of Niveaux. Though the Guardians were essentially immortal, when cut down in battle, their bodies reverted to their scarecrow forms, unable to wake until they'd been mended. The Guardians became vulnerable, their hearts at risk of being picked up by any friend or foe, and so human partners became imperative. And simply because he was older, that was William's future. With all the glory and adventure it entailed, he would see the world. He would make a difference. And Charlotte would spend her days with the dead. Pushing her frustration away, Charlotte focused on the job at hand. "What happened to wake this wraith?" she asked, watching her grandmother as they left the orchards and urged the horses into a canter. In these parts, new wraiths were most often born unintentionally. A farmer embittered by a poor harvest or a lover scorned might meet with an accident, their spirit unable to let go of the dark emotions and move on. Sometimes, the wraiths were suicides. These were the most difficult settlings for Charlotte to shake afterward, the emotions roiling with each spirit, a mixture of fear and despondency. Charlotte's father had joked that grandmother was as stuffed with lavender as the parson was. That was how much peace the woman usually carried. But something shifted with Charlotte's question. The old woman released a sigh that rattled like bones in a breeze. "Tale as old as breath, I'm afraid," said grandmother. "A troop of the Cardinal's watch are moving through the county. A soldier wanted a woman, and she wasn't interested. It didn't go well." Charlotte's face grew hot. "She's fine, physically." The older woman took a deep breath and shook her head. "Her brother stepped in. The wraith is his." Charlotte's vision went misty as she watched tears weave over her grandmother's time-etched cheeks. Instead of sadness, anger hovered beneath the surface. She wanted answers and justice. Every religion had extremists. History was full of them. But the Cardinal's watch had never been brutal. The faith militant of the silent gods, their main purpose was to guard the Cardinal, as the Order guarded the royal family, and to keep peace in the streets of the capital. True, they often skirmished with members of the Order, but the stories Charlotte's father told had always been full of good-natured rivalry. No one ever got hurt. "The soldier will be punished, of course," said Charlotte. Grandmother's mouth kicked up at one corner, releasing a bitter laugh. "Years ago, that would have been the case," she said. "No doubt the incident will be twisted, so the Cardinal can blame anyone but her own." The The Order never would have let that happen, said Charlotte, swiping at her nose. In the 10 years since the death of the last king and queen, much had changed. When wraiths had been wielded with fearsome regularity, the power to drive them back made the old god and, by extension, the Order of Guardians necessary. But the presence of bone wielders had waned over the years, and the people of Niveaux had turned to gods promising health and prosperity. Then the king and queen had been killed, Charlotte's father along with them, and blame for the assassination had been laid at the Order's feet. They'd been sentenced to 10 years' exile from court, 10 years during which the guardians themselves were not allowed to wake and take their human forms. 10 years that were almost up. The want in Charlotte's chest opened up again, and she inhaled slowly to calm herself. Not for the first time, her grandmother seemed to hear her thoughts. "You think everything will be fixed when the guardians wake, but we must be cautious," she said. "The people and the crown still remember their failure." Charlotte opened her mouth to argue, but grandmother cut her a look. "They failed," said the woman simply. "The guardians will wake, and hopefully they will rebuild what was. For the last decade, however, they have not been here, and people tend to rely on what they can see." "So they turned to the Cardinal?" The title soured in Charlotte's mouth. "A woman claiming holiness as she grapples for power?" Her grandmother smiled sadly. "Cardinals of the silent gods have historically been women with the favor of the people. This cardinal is no different. Lorraine the Pure gives alms, lowers the price of grain, and demands allegiance for it." This was the crux of the shift in worship. When it came down to it, people didn't want to connect with a greater power. They wanted to align with something, anything, based on what it would do for them. And the old god seemed to have ceased giving back. "If she cares so much for the people," said Charlotte, "why allow violence in the name of those same gods?" Her grandmother's mouth closed into a grim line, but her grandmother said nothing. Charlotte drew a breath deep enough to stretch her lungs and swiped angry tears from her cheeks. She had a job to do. A wraiths family did not need her frustration. They needed solace. Charlotte and her grandmother reached a small cottage on the outskirts of Sparrow's Glen, the peaceful scene belying their reason for coming. The garden was green and reaching for the sun. Lambs in the field called for their mothers. A man came from the house to help grandmother from her horse. Charlotte dismounted, nodding toward 3 other family members lining the small porch. A mother and 2 young boys, all with tear-stained cheeks and red-rimmed eyes. Charlotte straightened her settling robes, brushing dust from the runes as she stepped toward her grandmother and listened to the man's story. "Jeff was already angry," he said, wringing large hands on a hammer he seemed to have forgotten he was holding. "Our daughter works the tavern in town, and last night a troop of the Cardinal's watch were resting over." The farmer swiped at his wet eyes. One of the young boys tried to speak, but his voice buckled as his mother hauled him to her side. "Jeff kept a man from taking what wasn't his, and everyone calmed down," said the father. "But on their way home, the man followed. Sylvie ran." Charlotte's grandmother nodded sagely, and though both she and Charlotte knew what had happened next, she asked anyway. "Then," said the old woman, retelling a loved one's transformation made it more real somehow. If something was real, well, something could settle, and settled things could heal. The farmer's wife inhaled deeply, as if donning armor. "We lay him out on the table for the watchin'," she said, "but his body wasn't even cold before he came back." Charlotte's heart sank. A wraith so angry that its creation was practically instantaneous could be difficult to settle. She and her grandmother may have a long evening ahead. "I am so sorry for your loss," said Charlotte. The Order of Guardians will wake soon. These attacks will not be allowed to stand. Charlotte, however, saw the truth in her grandmother's eyes. The Order might try to stand up to the Cardinal and put the watch back in its place, but it would be an uphill battle. The mother smiled weakly before ushering them inside. As they crossed beneath the kind face of the old god carved into the door's crossbeam, Charlotte noticed another, smaller symbol had been added beside it. A tiny crooked bird Charlotte had never seen before, the same blue as her robes. The cottage was unnaturally cool for spring, wraith cool, prickling the skin like burning embers. There were few windows, but lanterns threw dancing light throughout the space. In the corner, a girl sat staring at the table, tears streaming down her face. "Hello," said Charlotte kindly. The young woman made no move to acknowledge them, but stared at the candles surrounding the body stretched out on the large kitchen table. Charlotte barely contained a gasp of horror as she examined the boy, perhaps 14, half of his face bashed in by something heavy. He had been washed of blood and dressed in clean clothes, but above him, as if it had sprung from the dead boy's heart, drifted a shadow blacker than any naturally cast. The wraith was vaguely humanoid in shape, and as Charlotte pulled a bundle of lavender from her pocket, its head cocked toward her like that of a curious animal. It had no facial features, other than a pair of onyx eyes reflecting the surrounding candles like stars. Then came the images. Those vile enough to wield the dead could hear wraiths' voices, but people gifted to settle only saw the wraiths' memories. Pictures, either echoes of their death and misery or pleadings for peace. As prepared as Charlotte was, she still winced every time her mind was peppered with images. Darkness, an alley, a monster's smile, angry words, and something heavy. Wet, stinking cobblestones. Charlotte accepted the images, then took a calming breath and set them aside. It was a bare echo of what a wielded wraith could do to assault the mind, but it could still be damned uncomfortable, even for those who were trained. Her grandmother lit a bundle of lavender and whispered as she walked circles around the table. Whispers of calm, of hope, reassuring the boy's spirit that it could let go, as though the rage holding him on this side of death was little more than a bad dream. Charlotte swallowed thickly and used the nearest candle to light her own lavender. Then she began her own litany of encouragement. As always, Charlotte chose an older tongue. Languages called to her heart, and speaking their ancestor language drew her spirit toward the earth. It connected her to everything, and she pressed into that connection as she circled the table. No matter the language, the meaning was the same. Charlotte and her grandmother halted, one on each side of the table, and began to sing together. "Run from the monsters, run from the dark, run toward the light, let it flicker and spark. Leave us for peace, but if you remain, allow me to give you a calming refrain." Charlotte sank beneath her grandmother's melody with a low harmony. Sweat broke out in the hollow of her throat, and Charlotte felt it trickle beneath her heavy blue robes. She struggled to keep hold of her song as she reached to comfort the wraith. Losing focus would mean starting over, stretching this settling into the night. Luckily, though the boy's spirit was restless, it was still that of a child. It began to move to the odd lilt of their ancient song. As it swayed, the wraith's edges frayed even more, smudging into the air around it. Then the spirit began to settle, lowering itself gently toward the boy's body and the bones within. Charlotte waited. For some reason, the wraiths always chose her in this moment. Only the wraith's head was visible when panic spiked. The wraith pushed toward Charlotte, its eyes flashed, and a new picture entered in her mind. Water, filtered sunlight, and the laughter of children picking wild summer berries. She nodded once. "I see you," she whispered, and the wraith disappeared into his bones. A small sniffle from the mother behind Charlotte was the only sound. She pulled the lavender smoke deep into her lungs and closed her eyes, soaking up the silence and peace a successful settling brought. Then she turned to the family. "Is there a stream?" she asked, "with blackberry brambles?" The father swiped tears from his cheeks and met his wife's weak smile with one of his own. "At the back of the property," he said. "Bury him far enough from the river that flooding won't reach him," said Charlotte's grandmother, leading the parents back outside. "If you ever move, call on us. We will help you take him along or resettle him in holy ground." Charlotte made to follow, but behind her someone spoke. "Scars." Charlotte turned. The boy's sister had not stopped crying, but her eyes met Charlotte's with resolve. "What?" said Charlotte. "The man who did this," said the girl. "His face was covered in scars." Out in the yard, the family thanked them. Then Charlotte and her grandmother turned their horses toward home. They rode silently along a little-worn game trail until her grandmother peeled toward Braden to record the location of the boy's burial at the old God's chapel. Charlotte wasn't in the mood for market crowds, so she turned toward their orchards and Sand Manor. Charlotte crested the last hill near noon, and the calm she had initially felt as the wraith settled into its bones evaporated. As always, she had harbored hope that helping the boy would somehow settle her, remind her how important the work was. But the shadows of that cottage had seeped into her bones. Charlotte tried to swallow her frustration. Caring for wraiths was necessary and noble. It was how Worth, their guardian, had started, after all, settling bones and building straw men in the shelter of the mountains. Her grandmother said the dead deserved mercy, and Charlotte didn't disagree. She also couldn't help but think that sometimes the living deserved to pay.